They're coming to get you, Barbara.
What do people call you, Pete?
Mr. Joshua.
What's your name? Schreck.
They're coming for you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're ignorant.
Look, there comes one of them now.
Alrighty, and well, welcome back. We've been off the air for a while, about 2 months or so. I guess you could call this season 2 of Schreck Talk that we're starting now. We kind of stopped because nobody was really listening. It got to be very, very tiresome and hard for me to do those videos every week. It took at least 4 hours just to work up, doing the post-production stuff, not including the recording and the pre-production stuff. So we kind of stopped for a little while. We were thinking about doing this up kind of at our own pace since nobody's really listening anyway. But we really have fun doing this. We're thinking about maybe doing some videos, stuff like that. So we're just kind of spitballing some ideas here, coming back with a new few episodes. I don't know if we're going to be doing them every week, but we'll see how it goes. So with us back this week, coming back this week, we're going to be doing the greatest decade in music. Mr. Joshua, can you tell us about the greatest decade in music?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not going to be what most people would expect when you're talking about a greatest decade of music. It's not something that's directly related to the years, the numbers that have mattered. Like, it's a decade, a solid decade in a row.
We're not going to be the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. It is 10 consecutive years, starting one year, going for 10 years, when the best music came out.
Yeah, now this is a really hard question to answer because it's not something so simple, but we'll explain the reasons why I feel this. I believe you agree with me.
I think both of us agree that this is the greatest 10 years of music.
Yeah, now most of there's a lot of other bands that I like that aren't in this, and most of the bands I listen to, I would say, are not necessarily in this genre, but every band I listen to this from the genre are in my favorites. They're some of the best. There's other things about it. That's from 1966 to 1975. That is, in my opinion, and apparently yours, what is the greatest decade. Now, there's multiple reasons why I feel this. The changing culture in America, up until this point, in mainstream music, you had very little options. You had country had come back in a while ago. You had gospel. But it was very limited. There wasn't too many mainstream options. Radio was becoming more popular. TV was becoming a thing. And album sales were starting to become. It wasn't just singles so much anymore. It was becoming albums. And so we started to see a lot of bands coming in and a lot of new artists coming out of different styles and new genres forming and just a lot of creativity because of the culture and what was going on at the time.
Yeah, I would say that before the Beatles hit in the early 60s, it was about, music was a casual thing. By 1966, music was a way of life. The whole hippie movement was...
You can even pull it kind of started with the beatnik movement a little bit, but it wasn't there, but you had that kind of grassroots thing. You started seeing a lot of people coming up like Bob Dylan, the band, and these people that were very salt of the earth kind of people, just who grew up. It's like it grew simultaneously almost with the hippie movement, but it's just these people who loved music, worked, kind of struggled to deal with it, and that was what they lived. They started going out and finding a way to just get their music out to people any way they could. They played in clubs, they traveled around trying to get the word around, and it started to get a little easier to record. So you started seeing a lot of people, but you got so many names that were coming out of there, like Barbra Streisand. I mean, there's someone. I'm not sure if Aretha Franklin started in that thing, but she was definitely
big in the late 60s.
She was definitely
and 70s.
I mean, you had Elvis, the King, making a great comeback in 1970. With his shows in Vegas and stuff like that. There was just so many names. I mean, I can't even go through the list. I can't even name all of them. But I mean, you had funk coming out at this time. You had soul, James Brown. so many names now that we associate with legendary icons, these huge status symbols. You know, I mean, you don't see as many from the decades that came later, the eras that came later. You know, you get your Madonnas and stuff, but you don't get your people like the Rolling Stones made their name in this era. The Who, there's these bands that people will. So I mean, even more obscure bands like the Animals. I mean, everybody knows the House of the Rising Sun. That song is part of our culture, and I hate that song. You know. It was written by Bob Dylan, maybe that's why. I mean, Hendrix, Joplin,
Well, just, we're both, the majority of our stuff is like rock, and we grew up on classic rock, 80s hair metal. We were into a lot of, as we got older, our taste grew into more like more metal and stuff like that. But we grew up on classic rock and 80s hair metal. And just so how you were going there, just so many bands like hit their stride or peaked or had a peak or started during that decade, that 10 years. The Beatles, the Stones, the Who, Doors, Jimi Hendrix, Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Kiss, Alice Cooper, Rush, Aerosmith, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Queen. The list just goes on and on of like people that are the names in music. I mean, people all around the country still have posters on their wall of Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and stuff like that. People are still, 40 years after the fact.
AC/DC.
Yeah, AC/DC. They started in 74.
Yeah.
All these bands that are still around that people are still listening to. I guarantee you that one of these bands from the 66 to 75 are still are on the radio 24/7 somewhere in the world. There's one of these bands' songs being played.
Oh, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, it's no matter what you do, their status. I just think it was a combination of so many things that came together at that point. And I mean, we wouldn't have all of our modern genres of music if it wasn't for that decade right there, that era. We wouldn't. I mean, hip hop and stuff, even stuff we're not into. We wouldn't have seen a lot of this mainstream music, dance. You had disco coming out in that era. I mean, I like disco. I kind of don't want to admit it, but I mean, it's a kind of fun thing. You had that starting at the end of this era, even at the very end of this era. I mean, so you can't really underscore how important the artists that came out of here, from your folky Neil Youngs and Bob Dylans, I mean, the modern soundtrack was invented. I mean, you wouldn't have films with the music scores. I mean, it was all film scores up until this point. The first time you had with Easy Rider the use of popular music in a film,
and like Dennis
part
Hopper,
of our culture.
Yeah, Dennis Hopper just put that together just from the records in his collection, not knowing if he was going to have any of the rights or be able to put those songs in the movie, but he did it anyway. And that changed the face of the movie industry.
Yeah,
too.
And they liked it so much. It was originally supposed to have a score, if I remember, by Crosby, Stills and Nash or someone like that. A big artist at the time, and still a memorable artist. But you now see this thing, how it started to become part of our culture. I think that was 69?
69, yeah, so right around there, 68, 69.
I mean, so you can see at this point how important music had become in part of it.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, the whole hippie movement, I think, had its roots in the music. I mean, the whole hippie movement wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the music. And the music fed off of the hippie movement, and that's how it became so big. And like I said, it's became a way of life in the 60s, around about 66. Music became a way of life instead of just for, musicians and stuff like that. We consider ourselves metalheads. We would not have the love of the music that we have if it wasn't for this decade and that kind of that influence that this time, the way that media treated music, the way the people treated music, it wouldn't have come about if it wasn't for that period of time right
there.
Yeah,
it was two things. It's the way the music affected the culture affected the music, and then the music affected the culture as a result. I think it really speaks to people. A lot of people are really based around lyrics and things like that. And at this point, you started to get a lot more exploration. The themes on lyrics you're gonna have. I mean, you have songs that talk about we're starting to talk about political themes more.
It wasn't just Mr. Sandman, Send Me a Dream anymore.
It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. They talked. You had what was the Buffalo Springfield song, Ohio, where they're talking about people getting shot up at a university and killed and stuff. I mean, current events. And so it really has started to affect people. I think there's studies now that show how music affects the brain is one of the most things that can stimulate the brain more than anything else. It's amazing, and I think this era, as you know, as much as people look at music, modern music, and forget about the past, this is the era where I think people haven't really forgotten about it yet. People forget a lot of the late 70s. They've forgotten the 40s and the 50s music a lot. That's not very popular anymore. But these songs still stick around. These songs are still hits. You hear these at arenas still. You hear these at...
And this just isn't old fogey music either. I mean, our favorite artist and our dad's favorite artist all came... I mean, they're all the same. But Alice Cooper came at the same time. Sarah Plain and Tall loves CCR.
Yeah, you had Sabbath, the start of the metal, which now is gone, and you have met people who are into extreme forms of metal who still love Sabbath. It's still, even if they're not into other kinds of music.
Yeah, you got to respect that.
Yeah,
and you know, it was a renaissance time for music. I mean, you know, music had been kind of blasé, the same for so long. A little bit of changes here and there. Rock music kind of kicked in the door in the 50s, but it wasn't until the late 60s. I mean, even the Beatles sounded just like poppy, mostly what was on the radio. But when they get to, you know, your White albums and your, you know, your Abbey Roads and stuff, where people are starting to experiment, Hendrix coming out and just change the way the electric guitar was played, you know, throwing an organ in there like the Doors did in the 60s. And then you get into the 70s and you get these, you know, Midwestern, you know, hard rock bands like Kiss and stuff like that, who took basically everything that was great about like Helter Skelter and they just put that into their music, you know, and these whole genres kind of started popping up. You know, you had metal, and then like you were saying, you had, you know, funk, punk, new wave. Techno has its origins in there. Just listen to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon and you'll hear that technical influence on like On the Run and The Great Gig in the Sky and stuff.
Yeah, and then you had the, you know, in the earlier you still had the psychedelic stuff with you know, the Beach Boys and stuff with the Pet Sounds and things like that, where they were still experimenting with different sounds. With, I mean, there's just so many unique things that were going on. I mean, new instruments were being developed. You know, electronics was new, like massive.
Synthesizers started coming out.
Multi-tracking on albums. You know, I mean, that's something we can't.
The first stereo album ever recorded was recorded in 1967.
Yes.
Or it was released in 1967, Sgt. Pepper. Or 1966, the very first year. Before that, everything was mono. And now we look at stereo and we're like, we don't even bat an eye that stereo is a thing. But back then, it was a big deal, and it first happened in 1966.
To have two channels where you can hear the sound, like different sounds, different ears, it changes your entire experience. Now we have 5.1 sound. My movie theater, we have an 11.1 sound theater that, you know, it has it from that many different channels because you can experience that many different things. And I think you can't really... that you know, I can't believe it took us this long to mention how much that changed the industry and how much that changed the music. The ability for you to have a little more freedom in the studio to not have to get it right in one take.
Yeah, it was no longer 8 or 16 track takes or anything like that.
No.
You had you know, the multi-tracking and everything like that you could do, and it really kind of, you know, it sums up, and bring up another album, Dark Side of the Moon again. It sums it up in that album. You just listen to that album and you listen to all the different sounds and stuff like that they had in there. Now, they were doing that before then, but it really like hit its peak there. And then, you know, you had the prog rock scene with Yes coming out and stuff like that during this period of time, I think, where, you know, you just had all these big changes. Like I said, it was a renaissance time in music. And, you know, I think sort of, at least in our genre of music, we're in another renaissance period where a lot of, you know, like in metal and stuff like that, you know, we're incorporating a lot of like symphonic elements. There was the whole rap metal scene and everything like that about 15 years ago.
Well, funny you mentioned that because I was going to relate it to classical. Because when you would go see an orchestra live before, you know, before you had multi-tracking, you would go to see an orchestra live. It had multi-layers. You know, the orchestra was set up in a way, and the sound bounces, reflects in a way that it gave it a unique soundscape. and you couldn't really get that just on a mono recording. And so when you could add those options in, you now develop those abilities to bring home that live experience that you couldn't have. That's really almost what it's like, because when you're live, you can do it. You have the speakers coming out of the sounds coming out of different areas, and it allows you to create different options for the people. I mean, I still listen in my car, and I'm shocked when I hear the stereo effect and how good it can work.
And
on
you know what? It really, really sucks when you've got a speaker out on your left or right channel, and you only hear that channel, though.
Yeah, that does stink. But
it popped up the whole industry of like stereo buying. Now that has died out because of the access, of iPods and the internet and everything like that. But nobody really had stereos. They had like a little turntable,
or even a radio,
They didn't really have anything. And then you see this big explosion in the 70s where people are going out and spending thousands of dollars on these big amplifiers and their turntables, and you had these giant speakers and everything like that. I mean, that totally boomed the electronics industry, because people, when Sgt. Pepper came out, most people didn't have stereo. They didn't have two speakers. So they were listening to a stereo album with only one speaker.
Yeah. And just another random thought that popped in my front. The live experience. I mean, think about it. The stadium experience started in, 65 with the Beatles. So you didn't really... But by 1970, you had already had Woodstock in 69.
And then you had Watkins Glen in 71, I think.
I mean, there was just so many.
Yeah,
the
and then
you
got into you got into all this other stuff with like Texas Jam and stuff like that in the later 70s, and you had these big festivals that started up. I mean, you don't realize I don't even realize, as we're sitting here talking about all the stuff that came about because of this decade of music. Stereo. Surround sound. We have surround sound now because of that. The music industry, stereos, the concert experience, stadium tours, all that stuff came about because of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to like watching That Thing You Do, where they're doing the state fair tour with all the bands, where they come on and play 2 songs, and then the next band comes on. That was the experience before this era.
Because it was all about singles back then.
It was the single era.
I mean, even early in the Beatles.
We could almost. I'd like to think of it as the album era. I mean, even though albums had existed before then, it really hadn't caught on, I would say.
And a lot of times they were just precursors to, the artist wanted to do more songs, wanted to get more songs out there. But the record industry was like, we just want singles. We want you to make these singles. Well, when you get a band like the Beatles, who their albums are filled with singles, are filled with hits, that caused a whole shift. And I find it hard sometimes to go through like my iTunes. Like I got a bunch of Johnny Cash and stuff like that, who, by the way, in 1968 released Fools in Prison and made his comeback. Great freaking album. But I find it hard to organize his singles, because a whole bunch of his songs that I have are singles. This was on this single, this was on this single. I got to go research and all this stuff. When the Beatles came along, and by the time you hit the the end of that decade, the 75, nobody was releasing just hardly straight singles anymore. Maybe ABBA. But other than that, most people were just releasing full-length albums, and then they would release singles from those albums.
Yeah, and if you think about it, the album era, as I coined it a little while ago, lasted for 30 years. I mean, we left it and we're back into the single era again now with the digital technology. But it was a huge changing point for the industry. It was a huge changing point for music in general, because it changed the landscape as communication gave us the ability to get it out to more people much more easily. It changed how people lived, and I think it really has become so much a part of so many people's lives. And I think it started here. It had always been part of our lives. People have always loved music. Music has always been part of being a human being. That's something we find very pleasing, I would say. But it really took hold of...
Yeah, they call prostitution the first profession, but I'll guarantee you the first hobby was music. Somebody got a snake skin, draped it over a drum or something like that, or something hollow, and started making music. I mean, or just rapping on the wall with some sticks. Music has been around forever.
Whistling.
But I don't think it hit, its full potential and showed you what it could actually be until this decade. Like I said before, it was all about musicians like music, and rich aristocrats and stuff like that. But for the most part, the average person who wasn't musically inclined or anything like that just kind of listened to it in a passing way. But when the music started to take on more meaning, started to mean more to the people, it built up a culture around it. And now you have, your techno cultures, us, you have our metalheads. I mean, there's the country people who are all into their country and stuff like that. I mean, there's whole groups of people that they didn't exist before this decade, but they are now a permanent part of our society since that decade.
Yeah, and you get people like the Grateful Dead, where their followers are so passionate, they would literally follow the band around and go see them at every tour. They gave up their lives to just become part of this traveling crew. I mean, that's how much it got to these people, and that's how much this, it stands out. I can think of Dave Matthews Band's the only other band I've ever seen that people really do that kind of stuff for, where they have that dedicated of a following.
Well, Fish is kind of like a Grateful Dead ripoff, but they've done the same thing. Lars Ulrich, before he came into Megadeth, he actually toured across Europe, or Metallica. Sorry, he actually toured across Europe with Diamond Head or Venom, I believe. So because of that decade, that a whole culture is built up around going to see music. And if you just look at the bands these bands are going to be around when all your Rihannas and all your One Directions are long forgotten, people will still be listening to The Who, to the Stones, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Kiss. These people are still going to be listening to them long after all the stuff that we have now is still around, because that decade was so inventive, so creative, and it left a lasting impression on everything.
I wouldn't go as far as to say all the bands that you named. I'll probably agree with you on that they'll be forgotten. But, there's a lot of artists that I'm surprised how well they're sticking around. I mean, I was thinking about it today, looking at PT's CDs, and she had a Coldplay, and it had a live from 2003. And I was like, Coldplay's been around, and they had a live DVD in 2003? So I mean, there's a lot of bands that have now been around 15, 20 years that people still are passionate about radio. People still talk about Radiohead. And I mean, but a lot of bands that, mentioned bands being forgotten, there are a lot of forgotten bands from that era. But when I listen to them, because of my taste in music and the things I think we're going, I still think that they're better than most of the bands that are current or known from other eras. Even the forgotten bands from those eras, I think, are wonderful.
Well, and there's a lot of artists from like the 80s, like Motley Crue and stuff like that are still around today. But in Coldplay, they've been around for a while. There's still bands in the 90s that are still around today. But the bands from that decade, their music long after these other bands, Motley Crue, are forgotten about, Coldplay, long after they're forgotten about, these bands will still be out there. People will still listen to the Beatles. People will still listen to, Aerosmith. Those things they're timeless because of the time period, and no time period has done it as well as they did it then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's much more we can say. I think the music was great. The people are legendary, even outside of the music I prefer. Those people are still icons. Stevie Wonder. These people, I don't care two honks about. But they're icons as well. I mean, that's because that's how great it was. That's how good it was. These people. I mean, there's nothing more to say about it.
Yeah, the music's not only great, but it changed the lives. The future of our lives forever. Because of that decade, our lives are changed forever. So we kind of come up with, there's the big albums out there that everybody's heard of, the Led Zeppelin 4s, the Dark Sides of the Moon, these kind of albums, pretty much anything the Beatles ever released. But we've come up with about 5 albums apiece, that we think you should probably go and check out if you haven't already. They're a little bit lesser known, some of them anyway. You might have heard of the band, but this is a lesser known album you should probably go check out. So we'll kind of start with, I'll start with myself. So my first one here is going to be The Outlaws. Their first album, The Outlaws, released in 1975. They're a lot like Lynyrd Skynyrd that time. They've got a whole Southern rock kind of feel going to them. And that first album little bit more country-ish, I guess you could say, than Lynyrd Skynyrd, who was a little bit more rockish. But if you listen to the last song on that album, Green Grass and High Tides, it blows Freebird out of the water. Go check that one out. Yes. Just listen to the guitars on that one. It blows Freebird away.
Just remember, I kept my mouth shut.
All right, so you're going to be one of yours here.
Yeah, my one here randomly is actually going to be by a pretty large artist. And I happen to think it's better than their landmark album, which was the album right after it. And that would be Pink Floyd's Obscured by Clouds. It's actually a soundtrack.
I've got to totally disagree. It's not better than Dark Side of the Moon.
You can't what? Okay, the what? Oh, there you go. Remember, I kept my mouth shut. It's a lot more... It does most of the same things. It has a song that's better than any song off of... I mean, it's hard to say a song's better than Time, but it's got a song in Childhood's End that's better than Time, in my opinion. And it's just, for me, it feels more like I enjoy, except it does have one thing. The last song on the album is a little different, a little unusual, but I actually like it. I feel it gives it a unique thing, and it's the most forgotten album. Most people don't even know it exists. I mean, the early albums that I don't enjoy as much are even more popular than it. So there's one of mine.
All right, so I'll go to another one here. This is an album that I didn't discover. I mean, I knew some of the songs, including the hit, the title track, but I really didn't get into the album until a few years ago, about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Bought it on vinyl. Freaking love this album. That's Grand Funk Railroad. This is one of them things where you see a mixing of genres. You got the rock that was big in this year. I think it was 73. And then you've got the funk that was going on at the same time, hence Grand Funk Railroad. There's just so many great songs on this one. My personal favorite is The Railroad. But Black Licorice, Stop Looking Back, the title track, We're an American Band, just an all-around great album. Really sums up that whole, let's do do our own thing kind of decade that they were going on there. What's another one from you?
Mine actually is from the band Free. It's called Fire and Water. It has a song I'm sure you've heard on it called All Right Now. Which is actually one of the weaker songs on it, I think. It's just a good bluesy rock album. There's not much more to say about it. If you've heard, All Right Now doesn't really fit in with the rest of the album. I mean, Remember is probably my favorite song from the album, which is a really relaxed, down song. I don't really know how to describe it. It's easygoing, bluesy music. I like it a lot.
All right, and my next one is going to be from a band that's pretty popular. This was before they hit their peak, though, when they got really popular. This is the album that almost killed their career, and if it wasn't for the next album being so amazing, they probably wouldn't be around today. And that's going to be Rush, Caress of Steel. I believe this was 1975 as well, early 1975, because 2112 followed that up. This was the first one where they really started getting really experimental and really kind of crazy. There's only 5 songs on the album. The last 2 are, between the 2 of them, are about almost 30 minutes apiece. The Necromancer, great freaking song, and then the Fountain of Lamneth. This is where Rush really started to get good, I think, is when they started getting very experimental, doing their proggy stuff, and making these long, epic songs. So Caress of Steel by Rush.
My next choice is going to be from a band called Rare Earth, which has a couple songs you've heard or seen in movies, I'm sure. Most people know it is I Just Want to Celebrate is on the album. The album's called One World. That song is actually on the one you might know is actually on the album. They also have another song called Big Brother, which isn't on the album, which you might know as well. There's a few other ones that
Get Ready is a really popular song.
Get Ready is pretty popular as well. Yeah, they're kind of I don't know, a funky psychedelic band. I don't know how. I always think of my father and my mother because they used to dance to the live album, which came out the same year. Was recorded on that tour. What year did that album come out? 71.
71? Okay, I would pick, if there was a time right in the middle there was a band that you could listen to that sounded just like that exact time period, 70, 71, it would be Rare Earth.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. They really describe the
middle of that decade.
Yeah, and I think I was looking through it in 71. There's so many great albums that came. I mean, that was just... At this point, this is when it started kicking in all gears. I noticed, I think when we were discussing our list, that we didn't have any from the 60s. I did have 2 from 1970, but I didn't have any from the 60s because I don't know, the more hard rock stuff, which is what we're into, came out a little later.
I also had a hard time picking some stuff from the 60s just because everything that I was thinking of was already so big. The Hendrixes, and the Beatles and stuff like that. And in fact, that leads to my next one, which is a Doors album, a little bit lesser known. The most popular one is obviously the first one, which has Break On Through, Light My Fire, and then the last one, which is probably my favorite, LA Woman, but you got Riders on the Storm, LA Woman. That one's pretty popular too. But the album that came out right before that, when they kind of did that transition to that bluesy stuff, came out in 1970, I believe, was Morrison Hotel. Just a great all-around rock and bluesy album. Definitely one that, as far as the Doors go, is a pretty big favorite of mine. What's your next one?
My next one is from a band called Montrose. Oddly enough, they're most known for they had a couple of hits back with their original singer, Sammy Hagar. You may
have heard of him. He plays. He was in Van Halen.
I think it was called Van Hagar. That was the name of the band. I'm not sure. But they did 2 albums with him, which were pretty good albums. I own both. But in 1975, they got a new singer named Bob James, I believe his name is. Nobody ever heard of him. Have no idea what's happened to him ever since. But he did 2 albums with them. The first of which was called Warner Brothers Presents Montrose. Has one of the most beautiful covers I've ever seen. This is another album my father got me into. Our father got me into, and it's straight out rock and roll. There's some good a couple of cover songs on it. Like Black Train, which is probably my favorite song on the album, and Clown Woman, which is his hilarious lyrics, and it was really good. Montrose, if you've heard, the songs off the first album, the rock style he has. It's very
it's guitar driven.
It's very guitar driven, 70s hard rock.
So my last one here is going to be another artist you probably heard of, but you probably heard of some of his hits. But that's going to be Ted Nugent and his first album. He was actually part of a psychedelic type band called the Amboy Dukes in the late 60s, early 70s, and then they transitioned over to Ted Nugent and the Amboy Dukes. And then this was the first album where he dropped the Amboy Dukes terminology and just became Ted Nugent. Hey Baby, Stormtroopin', Motor City Madhouse, Stranglehold, all these songs are on this album. This album is just like, this is rockin', kick-ass guitar music right here. I mean, Ted Nugent is a guitar god, and this is where he did it his best.
My last choice is from a band you probably haven't heard of. They're called Blood Rock. This was their second album. It came out in 1970. It's called Blood Rock 2. Very creative name. I guess they were in the...
They probably stole it from Led Zeppelin.
I don't know. Maybe they were into sequels, like, Planet of the Apes 2.
But their 2 was a regular 2. It wasn't a Roman 2 like Led Zeppelin. So they were original in that respect.
Yeah, there you go. Got to give them something. But it's got one unusual track that was a hit off of it that's nothing like anything else in the album, a song called DOA, which is very ahead of its time, I would say.
Yeah, ahead of its time, creepy, disturbing.
Gothic, kind of. Got some weird tones to it. But the rest of the album is mostly just straightforward rock and roll. It's a band from the Midwest. I think they're from Texas somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where in Texas, but... somewhere down in Texas, and they just they put out a bunch of albums and everybody forgot about them, and it's pretty rocking. It's straight out, fun. It's different. It's something you don't hear. Like I said, the quality of the bands that are forgotten in this era are just as better than the quality of bands that are remembered in other eras.
All right, so I just want to mention 2 more that if you don't want to go out and pick up these albums or anything like that, but you want to get the full experience of this greatest decade, I've actually divided it in half here. You've already mentioned one of them. Go find yourself the Easy Rider soundtrack. It's got Hendrix on it. It's got Steppenwolf. It's what made Steppenwolf famous, basically, is this album. And then for the 70s era, it came out quite a bit later in 1994, but the Dazed and Confused soundtrack. So many great 70s rock songs on there. Go check out those 2 if you don't want to check out some of these other ones. Any final thoughts on the greatest decade of music, 1966 to 1975?
Yeah, we talked about a lot of stuff, but we didn't hardly nerd out on all our bands that we really love. We mentioned Alice, and we mentioned Floyd, and we mentioned all these Kiss and all these bands, but we didn't really get to do the geek out thing because we didn't want to talk about that. We wanted to talk about the other things, like
we're
to
gonna
show how many other points there was, how much other great stuff there was in this era besides what we love.
Yeah, we're going to have episodes probably about Kiss and Alice. We've already done a Floyd one, probably a Rush, maybe a Zeppelin, Aerosmith, whatever. But we wanted to kind of just talk about the whole music scene in general for that period of time and how, in our opinions, 100%, I think both of us agree that that was the greatest 10 years of music that we can think of, at least from our perspective.
Bone.
Go away or I shall taunt you a second time.